I'm John. I'm an elder here. I've been in this church for about 25 years. Welcome. I'm glad you're here. It's an honor to preach God's word. Let me pray briefly, and then we'll get into it. Father, I am humbled. I am honored to bring your word today. I pray that you would anoint my words, that they may enrich people's lives, that it would build them up, that it would pierce their hearts, that it would bring the wisdom and the change and the blessing that you have for your people today. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So this is part 2 of Lazarus being raised from the dead. So if you missed last Sunday, we got halfway through, and now we're going to do the second half of this. So no spoiler alert there, Lazarus makes it, right? As you recall, Jesus is approaching Bethany when Mary and Martha are mourning. His death and Martha went out, are mourning his death, and Martha went out from the house and spoke to Jesus. Before we dive into the passage today, the second half, I think it might be helpful to give some larger context to the passage. Let's zoom out for a minute and talk about the Gospel of John in general. So the Gospel of John has what are called the 7 miracles of the Gospel of John, and Lazarus rising from the dead is the 7th one of those. It's also about halfway through the Gospel of John, and the Gospel of John by this point has gotten kind of long for us, right? So I thought, let's look back on those 7 miracles. There are sermons on each one of these, and so I'm not going to go deep into these miracles, but I think contextually to take them together and say, what are we supposed to be gleaning in a larger context from the Gospel of John is useful. What is the point of the Gospel of John? Have you even asked yourself that? Well, we don't have to guess. Near the end of the Gospel, in John 20, he tells us, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So, the point of the Gospel of John is that we may believe. And so that's a little different than like Luke or Matthew, where there's a little more extensive recordation of what Jesus did. John's trying to bring an agenda here to say, this is important that you believe. The raising of Lazarus from the dead is the last of what are referred to as the 7 miracles of the Gospel of John. So as we explore the last miracle, let's take a minute to look back on the previous 6. The first one was water turned into wine from John 2. And we're supposed to read that this miracle as well, it's kind of nifty, right? But that's not what we're supposed to get from it. What we're supposed to be doing is helping it build up our faith. And so we see that he's a God who has dominion over the physical universe. Isaac Newton created calculus to try and discover the secret of alchemy, and he never really got there. Jesus did it as a wedding gift. Even down to the molecular level, Jesus was the Lord of the physical universe. Second miracle was healing of the nobleman's son near death. This shows us the character of God is he's the great physician. He knitted us together. He knows our physical needs, and he's able to cure all our ailments. The third miracle, healing of the lame man at the pool. This man had been crippled for 40 years, and there's no doubt that his healing was a miracle. But that actually wasn't the point that was made out of the healing of the man at the pool of Bethsaida. It was that he healed him on the Sabbath to establish that Jesus is the God of the Sabbath. He's the one who perfected the law, and he's not contained by the law. Fourth miracle was feeding of the 5,000. The miracle shows he is a compassionate God who cares about our needs. He's the God of provision who can multiply in ways we can't understand. The fifth miracle was walking on water. He's the God that comforts us through the physical and spiritual storms of life. He has authority over the laws of nature. Also, Peter walks on water for a short time until fear overtakes his faith. Jesus is showing us that his power and authority can be reflected in us through our faith. And then the sixth miracle, the healing of the man born blind. Jesus is the God over all sin. At the time when a child was born blind, it was thought to be a curse because the child probably sinned in the womb, is what they surmised. And he was so evil that God had smote him in the womb. Jesus says it's not because of anything the man did or the parents did. Jesus points out that it is the general state of sin in a fallen world that such tragedies occur. But Jesus shows that he can overcome this sin and right what was made crooked. It's also symbolic that Jesus brings people out of the darkness into the light. The first six miracles point to the character and identity of Jesus as a powerful and compassionate Messiah. He clearly holds authority over all facets of creation. He understands our needs and meets us in them. Does this help you with your faith? To understand in totality what's John saying to us? That this is a God of signs and wonders who is present with us, cares about us, provides for us, looks out for us, goes ahead of us. Hollywood can make visual effects that make it look like a man's walking on water, right? But as far as I know, no one's been able to come up with a method to just walk out into what a body of water that looks like the San Francisco Bay under heavy storm conditions and just walk on out there. But that's what Jesus did when he walked on water. If I were asked to feed the 5,000 with loaves of bread, I'd throw those bad boys in a blender and everyone would get like one confetti of bread, right? Jesus did these things. They were miraculous, but he didn't monetize them. He didn't do them that he could build his personal fame. He built the glory of his Father because he wanted us to believe in him. Does that help your faith? That's what John wants us to get out of this book of the Bible. This brings us to this week's passage and the seventh of John's miracle, raising Lazarus from the dead. Now, the Gospel of John is the only gospel to record this miracle. In light of the purpose of John's gospel, we know that he recorded this miracle to help us believe that Jesus is the Messiah. How does raising Lazarus from the dead help us believe? Let's read the text. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at a place where Martha had met him. When the Jews had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out. They followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" He asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not have he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more, deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen, and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." How is this miracle supposed to help us grow in our faith? I have how many points? 3 points. Jesus meets us where we are and helps us to grow in our faith. Jesus goes first to show us that he is faithful in all things. And 3, we can be confident in our faith because Jesus will be there with us here in our lives and in eternity. So the first point, Jesus meets us where we are and he helps us grow in our faith. Let's go back to what Mary said to him when she went out to see Jesus. She said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Also, the Jews said, and we know from previous studies in the book of John, when it's referring to the Jews, it's talking about the priesthood or some of the authorities of the Hebrew faith. The Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not the one who opened the eyes of the blind have kept this man from dying?" Last week, when Martha went out and found Jesus, she said almost exactly the same thing. What we can glean from this is that the family's been sitting around for a couple of days when Lazarus got sick. And they said, "Go out and find Jesus and tell him to come." And so they sat there for days waiting for Jesus. And now he's been dead for 4 days, and they're still gathered together, and they're still waiting for Jesus. And they may have been grumbling a little. Everybody's kind of saying the same thing, right? If you had been here, this would not have had to have happened. Does that show unbelief? Maybe a little yes, mostly no, I think. Remember, Martha, in the previous passage, just said, "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." This is pretty good theology. It'd be hard to say that's coming from an unbeliever, right? And we have every reason to believe that Mary thinks the same thing. So when she goes out and confronts Jesus and says, "If you had been here, he wouldn't have died," is she saying, "I don't believe"? Is she saying, "You failed us"? I don't think that that's what it is. I mean, she is certainly speaking out of grief, but she's also speaking a truth, right? Jesus has been widely known to have healed people who were sick. And so if you had hurried here, we believe that you could have healed him and he would not have died. But there's a little bit of an accusation in here, like, where were you? You chose to not come. And he actually told his disciples, "We're going to wait a couple of days because Lazarus is going to go to sleep." So, I don't think it needs to be either unbelief. I think it's a little bit of skepticism. Through the other Gospels, we even know that he has previously raised 2 other people from the dead. But Christians aren't perfect, okay? We can have faith and doubt at the same time. We're called to believe that God is capable of all things. But I certainly have not seen God do all things. Even when I read reports of unusual events, I can be skeptical. Are you ever skeptical in your faith? Do you say, "I believe" with my mouth, but in my heart, I reserve control over certain parts of my life? When Jesus says, "Take up your cross and follow me," do you think yourself, "Okay, but only up to a point"? I think that that's what's kind of going on here. So let's talk about the skepticism in our faith. There were 2 other accounts of Jesus raising the dead. In Luke 7, Jesus raises a widow's son from the dead. Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother. She was a widow, and a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her and said, "Don't cry." Then he went up and touched the bier, and they were carrying him on it. And the bearers stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. They were all filled with awe and praised God. "A great prophet has appeared among us," they said. "God has come to help his people." This news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country. So in this account, what they ascribed it to is the miracles of Elijah and Elisha, who had also raised people from the dead. And they said, look, Jesus is a great prophet. It didn't get people to the place of saying, look, the Son of God, the Messiah, is among us. Again in Luke 8, Jesus raises the young daughter of Jairus. While Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," he said. "Don't bother the teacher anymore." Hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just believe, and she will be healed." When he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. "Stop wailing," Jesus said. "She's not dead, but asleep." They laughed at him, knowing that she was dead, but he took her by the hand and said, "My child, get up." Her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened. Again, strange, right? I'm going to raise someone from the dead, but only mom and dad get to see it. And then tells them, don't tell anybody. When he raises Lazarus from the dead, it's a little different pageantry than what was done previously. But let's go back to the cynicism. On June 12th, 2023, so last month, USA Today reported that a 76-year-old woman was declared dead from a stroke and heart failure in a hospital in Ecuador. Later that same day, they held a wake for her and were astonished when she knocked on the inside of her coffin during her wake. Pretty similar, right? Does anybody believe that she was raised from the dead? The family didn't. The Ecuadorian officials don't. They're doing an investigation into the hospital about where did you go wrong declaring this live woman dead. And so even when we hear these things, I think many people here are skeptical, right? Andrew touched on this last week. He said that the Jews believed that the spirit hung around the body for a while after death. I think Miracle Max from The Princess Bride captures this when he says it. And I'm sorry, I can't say this without my Billy Crystal impression because it just won't come out. It just so happens that your friend here is only mostly dead. There's a big difference between mostly dead and all dead. Mostly dead is slightly alive. All dead, there's only one thing you can do. Go through his clothes and look for loose change. And so, I'm sorry to be irreverent. However, you get what I'm going at. There is this skepticism in our culture of like, if you bring someone back from the dead, were they really dead? Did you resuscitate or did you raise from the dead? I think almost every instance, we would be far more willing to believe that they were resuscitated, not raised from the dead. It's easy to be skeptical. Historically, people fake their own death. People are reported dead by rumor, and it turns out they weren't. Bodies have been misidentified and the death attributed to a person who's still alive. This happened to Mark Twain. He was confused with his cousin and reported as dead. His famous response was, "The report of my death was an exaggeration." So we're not, you can't sit there and look at Mary and Martha and go, you have a crisis of faith because you're saying, if you'd been here, my brother would be alive. They do trust Jesus. They do believe that he is the God who came to save us. But they kind of haven't got there yet. And so skepticism is actually part of a faith walk, and that's okay. So why is Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead supposed to help us believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the true Son of God? The ancient Jews had a tradition that the dead should be buried within 3 days at most, because by then the body would start to smell so foul that it was pretty intolerable. So why do you think Jesus waited 4 days and said, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe? Because of skepticism? By waiting 4 days, there had been time for family and friends to travel from all around and mourn. Back then, they would hire professional mourners to come and wail in front of your house to proclaim the death of a family member. Unlike the 2 prior miracles where he raised the dead, this time it would be a spectacle with a wide audience. Ours is a God of signs and wonders, and that is astonishing enough in itself. But Jesus wants us to know that he is a God of signs and wonders for us. Jesus isn't a tyrannical God who just demands that we believe. He goes first and shows us that he is who he says he is, and he is more than capable of blessing us in all ways. Jesus is not being obtuse. Several times throughout the book of John, we've heard, particularly the Pharisees, asking him, speak plainly. Just tell us, are you the Messiah? Well, here it is. Lazarus is dead. All the way dead, not just mostly dead. And I waited 4 days until the body stinks to raise him from the dead for the skeptics, so that when I raise him from the dead, everyone will know that I am the resurrection and the life. Who does he want to know this? His disciples, the priests, his followers, unbelievers, everybody. He wants everybody to know that he is the resurrection and the life. Is it wrong to be skeptical in your faith? No, it's not. We're all still growing in our faith. The sin begins when you decide to rest in your skepticism. Revelation 3 says, I know your works. You are neither cold nor hot. Would that you were either cold or hot. So because you are lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. And so to find yourself in a place of skepticism is neither wrong nor sinful. But to become comfortable in that, Revelation tells us that is not where God would have us, and he will spit us out. Point 2. Jesus goes to show us that he is faithful in all things. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. It's important that we know that Jesus is who he says he is, because we need to have confidence that he's a big enough God to be there in our time of need. But he's also a God who's present with us when we have difficulties and when we struggle. The commentaries say that John uses 2 different words in this passage for weeping. When he talks about Mary and the Jews weeping, he uses the word that means loud wailing. The word that John uses when he says Jesus wept means also anger and outrage. Is Jesus weeping with those who weep? Yes, absolutely. But is he also foreshadowing his own death? And as he does, he's confronting sin and death in a very real way as he approaches Lazarus' tomb. And so yes, he shares the sadness of Mary and Martha, but he also feels true anger at the sin that led to this death. So Jesus weeps. He is pointing ahead to his own work on the cross that will overcome sin, death, and Satan. Even in death, Jesus is faithful. So what does it mean, or what do I mean, that Jesus goes first and shows us that he's faithful? Let me tell you a story. When I was 9 years old, my family decided we would all go skiing together for the first time. So there were 5 kids in my family. So my dad got us all bundled up in cold weather gear. We all tried on our skis and our boots the night before so we'd know what to do. He got us all chapstick and sunscreen and Kleenex and came up with plans for where we would ski and where we would gather for lunch. And he did all the things, right? And then he got all 5 of us lift tickets, and like a trail of ducklings, we go up to the bunny slopes and we all start getting ready to ski. Well, my little sister is only 5. And so my dad says, you guys go figure it out. I have to take care of your little sister. He's not doing anything wrong, but it's my first time on skis and I'm just supposed to figure it out. I'd seen the 1972 Winter Olympics. I had these images of me flying gracefully down the slopes, as, just as clean as the day is long, right? That all goes out the window before you even get to the first lift chair. If you've ever put on skis, you know that all of a sudden you just can't stand up anymore. It's like gravity starts gyrating and you just fall down standing on level ground. There are really 2 good reasons to get your kids started skiing when they're young. One is they can do the full splits without injuring themselves. And 2, they don't have the vocabulary to express the frustration. Learning to ski is hard no matter how good your instructor is, but telling a 9-year-old to teach himself is next level. Kids are not adept at patience, so I can't be emphatic enough in saying this was a frustrating experience. The adult equivalent of it might be like an IRS audit if they were allowed to beat you. You end up with bruises on your rear and all down your thighs, a fat lip, a lump on your head because we didn't wear helmets in the 70s, frostbite from the snow going down your jacket. You fall in ways you never knew were possible. And then you lie there exhausted and defeated until your brother comes by and says something snide. So you get up and go back for more. Sounds lovely, right? Don't let me discourage you. I grew up loving skiing, okay? You get past this point. But that first day, even by getting to lunchtime and you're like, there's 2.5 more days of this, you've got to be kidding. Let's contrast that with what Jesus did when he walked on water. Skiing, it's mortal, it's doable, it's difficult, it's frustrating, but Jesus walked on water and he did it first. And then Peter said, let me come to you. And he was able to do that. The difference between the will and the wisdom of man, as opposed to the grace and the power of God, is something that we need to incorporate into our understanding of our faith. Because if it's just left up to the will and the wisdom of men, we're sunk. But Jesus can stand on the waves and say, yes, I will bring you along too. The feeding of the 5,000. I've had bosses that give me tasks that are absolutely impossible. And they just say, get it done and give me regular updates and walk away. That's the way of the world. That's not the kind of God that Jesus is. So he does these signs and wonders so that we can truly believe that he will meet us and bless us. So that when we all encounter difficulty in life, because it's a consequence of living in a sin-fallen world, we may have financial problems, family problems, marriage problems, health problems, people who sin against us and hurt us. Sometimes it feels like we're dealing with all these issues at the same time. And some of these problems are going to be way bigger than we can handle. We can stand in our faith, knowing that he is the living God who went first before us. Proverbs 3 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. God commands our obedience. And a lot of his commands are really hard, like turn the other cheek. If someone mocks you for your faith, be glad. Love one another. Pray for your enemies. Repent and confess. Give generously and joyfully. I don't know about you, but every one of those commands is directly opposed to my human nature. I want my flesh to glorify me, to love me, and to praise me. And if I'm going to do the things that God commands me to do, I am going to need a champion who is bigger than me to empower me, lead me, show me, grow me into being that man. Point 3. We can be confident in our faith because Jesus will be there with us here in our lives and in eternity. Jesus once more, deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. So side note here, we asked, why did John think that raising Lazarus from the dead would bring us to deeper belief? Because Jesus said it would. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped in strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said, take off the grave clothes and let him go. When Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, he exhibits power that is definitively divine. He does it publicly, in daylight, and witnessed by many. He performs the miracle to show that he has authority not just here on earth, but in the heavenly realm also. When he calls forth Lazarus, there is no trickery. He just says, Lazarus, come out. And the text indicates to me that he did it right away. It doesn't say a couple of guys had to go in and see what happened and then dragged him out barely alive. He walked out immediately. This is different than Jesus' own resurrection, only in that Lazarus will die again in the fullness of time. This proves beyond a shadow of doubt that when Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life, whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live, and everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. That it's true. Why did Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead? He's just going to die again, right? Well, when Jesus dies on the cross and is raised on the third day, we might have been left scratching our heads saying, did he mean to do that? If there's too much mystery, some people may have just decided it's too much to figure out, and the resurrection would have been forgotten as a weird thing that happened. But because this guy who proclaimed himself as the Son of God showed us that he had the power over sin and death and then performed the final act of raising a dead man, we can be sure that when he died on the cross and was raised on the third day, this was no coincidence. This was not an accident. He called his shot, and then he did it. He actually took on the sins of the world. He actually died on the cross, and he actually was raised on the third day. There is a deeper implication here, because the Father in heaven is a God of righteousness. He can't tolerate sin to exist in his presence. He's a God of justice who will judge the sins of the world. But because Jesus took on our sins and became the sacrifice to satisfy God's wrath, we can have salvation through grace by faith. We can have blessings here on earth and in eternity because Jesus is the Messiah. The band can come up now. One of the things that Jesus asks us to do is spread the good news. That Jesus is who he said he was. He did what he said he was going to do. He has the power over earth and heaven. All authority on heaven and earth has been given into his hand. In order for us to go out into this community and spread that word to a people who are far from the kingdom of heaven, we have to have this confidence that we will not be made fools, that God has sent us on a righteous mission to proclaim his kingdom that they may be saved. And if we don't first believe this on our own, then we will do this ham-handed or not at all as we step out. And so go with confidence, knowing that the God of signs and wonders, the God of all power, the God of all creation, has sent you, not to fail, but to bring him glory and succeed. God bless you.